Government has assured all retail depositors of Ithala Bank that their money will be protected and guaranteed amid the ongoing process to wind up the state-owned business. The Reserve Bank's Prudential Authority has filed papers in the Pietermaritzburg High Court for the provisional liquidation of Ithala. The central bank believes the move is in the best interests of Ithala's about 257,000 depositors. In a statement, National Treasury says Ithala's clients could see their funds and accounts migrated to another banking institution. The administrator appointed by the Reserve Bank has found that Ithala is technically and legally insolvent, exposing depositors to the potential loss of their deposits. All right, joining us to discuss the liquidation application for Ithala Bank is Chartered Accountant Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. So this application by the Prudential Authority for the provisional liquidation of Ithala is somehow, for some many, almost reminiscent or quite similar to what we've seen with the VBS collapse. Your reaction to this liquidation application?
Good evening and good evening to the viewers. So I think there is a bit of a fundamentally important difference between the two, in the sense that when it came to the VBS process, it was on the back of this wholesale looting of the bank by those that were in charge of it. And obviously, the Reserve Bank had to step in and then remove them from those positions of authority. When it comes to Ithala, we have a bit of a complicated situation in the sense that Ithala actually isn't a bank. What Ithala was able to do is that it was able to conduct bank-related activities in the sense that it could take deposits only on the basis of an agreement that was first been given to it by National Treasury, and then later on, once the Reserve Bank had been restructured and the Prudential Authority had been created, then that particular exemption was then issued by the Prudential Authority wing of the Reserve Bank. And what that exemption simply said is that even though you're not a bank, will allow you to take deposits like other banks do on the proviso that eventually you will apply for a banking license, and once you apply for a banking license, then you should be fine. The problem is that Ithala simply never managed to get around that hurdle of applying for a full banking license. And at some point in time, the Reserve Bank then said, actually, this exemption is going to expire. And when the exemption expired in December 2023, the Reserve Bank then appointed a repayment administrator was going to oversee the deposit-taking activities of the bank, and it is on the back of that process that that person has then said, actually, I think there are far too many issues relating to the affairs of this institution. I don't think it's viable, and I don't think it should be allowed to carry on its business that it used to do, so the recommendation has been to liquidate that. So that is the difference between the two.
But now, when it comes to some of those issues, it had to do with capital, because I remember that at some point Action SA last year raised the alarms, saying that without capital injection by the KZN government or even Treasury, as a shareholder, Ithala would collapse. But it seems they didn't heed this call.
Well, the problem is that Ithala is actually owned by the KZN provincial government, which is a poisoned chalice on its own. And the reason it's a poisoned chalice is that according to the Banks Act, you cannot apply for a banking license if you're owned by a provincial entity. So for as long as that shareholding model remained the same, Ithala was essentially fatally condemned to failure because it was never going to be able to apply for a banking license until either the law was changed or the provincial government found a way of unleashing Ithala so that it could be a standalone entity. That's the first issue. The secondary issue is that obviously, even in the conduct of its own affairs, according to the Reserve Bank's publication yesterday, they said that in the past 10 years, the bank has lost over 520 million rand in net losses that is generated over a 10-year period. Now, obviously, that's not desirable. Banks need to remain profitable, because the moment banks are not profitable, you then have to ask yourself a very difficult question of, well, if there are losses and the losses are consistent, how are those losses going to be funded? Does it mean that this bank runs the risk of not being able to pay back the money that is due to its depositors? So therefore, you don't want any bank to be running at a loss. Some of them do so on a temporary basis, but you kind of want to see what the roadmap towards profitability is. And unfortunately, in that instance, what you want is that you then want the shareholder, the anchor shareholder, to then inject additional capital to get that to be corrected. And in this instance, the KZN government was never going to be in a position to put that capital, and they still haven't put that capital. So therefore, you have really this conglomeration of multiple issues that are affecting Ithala's operations and Ithala's corporate structure that simply made it very difficult for it to survive this process.
Now, if you insist that it's the corporate structure itself that was the poison chalice here, what then of the fight that they plan to wage? Because you've got Ithala saying they will challenge this liquidation application. KZN government is also being pushed to challenge this. You've even got political parties, the likes of the IFP, saying this is actually ill-advised on the part of the Prudential Authority to go this route or take this decision to apply for that liquidation.
It's very important for us to be able to say explicitly that politicians are talking absolute nonsense. It is the politicians that have overseen the processes where Ithala has gone to Parliament and said, look, this is the challenge associated with the corporate model that we have. This is what needs to be done different in order to be able to enable us to apply for a banking license. And for many years, Ithala has made particular presentations and representations to Parliament, and politicians have simply never got their head around getting this matter resolved. So whenever politicians then step into this conversation and they make these allegations and they promote all these conspiracy theories, you really need to take them with a pinch of salt, because you then have to ask them the question that, well, when this was tabled, in the many instances where Ithala had come to Parliament to explain the problems associated with its corporate structure and its ownership structure, when Ithala has explained what the roadmap needs to be in order to resolve its issues, what has actually been done in order to resolve that? And the answer is that the politicians have simply not been doing the job that they should have done. So I refuse to take them seriously. But I think the key issue here is that there is actually an example, because remember the Post Bank was in the same position in that for as long as it was owned by the Post Office, it was going to be impossible for it to essentially apply for a banking license. So they went through a process of tabling an amendment bill in Parliament. That amendment bill eventually became the Post Bank Amendment Act. So therefore now the Post Bank is in a position to apply for a license. That is the same process that Ithala should have followed, but those that should have championed it or those that should have actually promoted it within simply didn't do their job. So it is not advisable for them to then suddenly have opinions on what ought to be done so late in the stage when this has been going on for so many years.
So, Khaya, a court challenge would be futile in this respect, or possibly they could go to court and at the very least they would suspend the process to liquidate and give them or grant them that exemption again to try and comply.
No. So the process of compelling the Reserve Bank to grant an exemption, that's already been ventilated in the court, and it's very clear that no one can compel the Reserve Bank to actually grant an exemption. That is why the repayment administrator was actually appointed in December 2023. So you're not going to get into a position where a court says to a regulator, look, even though the rules have been very clear that in order for a person to undertake banking activities or other deposit-taking activities, they need to have a banking license, but you must give these ones a special exemption. That's simply not going to happen, and the litigation has already indicated to us that that's not going to be the way things are. So what really the only way in which this can be done is that you need to have a meeting of the minds between the politicians, the regulators, and obviously Ithala itself to then say, look, do we think that there's a possibility of Ithala correcting the sum of its errors in relation to its corporate structure, in relation to its licensing application, within a reasonable time frame that would enable us to say, look, you may indeed get a new exemption for a particular period of time. And unfortunately, given the litigation and the relationship that has deteriorated over time between Ithala and the regulators, you get the impression that the regulators are not really going to be coming forth and saying that we're going to make this concession. It's going to be a very difficult conversation, and I think it's become a conversation that has deteriorated so much, it is just very difficult to imagine how we're going to turn this around, unless, of course, there is a very clear or a very explicit political instruction that says so. But then again, political instructions to regulators are the type of thing that we always caution against, because, well, it starts with this one, who is to say that the next person who then wants the Reserve Bank not to enforce a particular action against them cannot approach their favorite politician in order to get there. So it starts a slippery slope, unfortunately.
Now, in all of this, there are depositors that are panicking today, uncertain about what this application actually means for them. What does it mean? And can or should they rush now to withdraw all their monies at this stage?
So what it simply means, unfortunately, is because we are now in the liquidation space, there is a bit of a complexity in the sense that they cannot transact in and out of their accounts as they wish or as they normally would. What then will happen is that the National Treasury has already said that those deposits are guaranteed. In other words, the money has not been lost. So what we then expect to see is that at some point in time, the Reserve Bank and National Treasury will then be able to issue an instruction to say that, look, those who had money in this particular bank and want to be able to access it, here's a new bank that you can be able to approach in order to be able to access your funds. In the case of VBS, Nedbank stepped in and they basically ran those affairs on behalf of VBS. So therefore, those that had money with VBS could be able to access it through Nedbank's channels. So in this instance, we expect to see the same on the basis that the National Treasury has indeed said that they are going to guarantee those deposits.
All right, Khaya, as always, thank you very much for your time. That's Chartered Accountant Khaya Sithole speaking to us.